Yesterday, US President Donald Trump spoke before the entire world. He stood up at the United Nations and spoke to the leaders of every country, to the peoples of the entire world, and he was laughed at. The President of the United States was literally laughed at when he spoke to the entire world. Giving his speech to the UN General Assembly that took place yesterday, he began his speech to the world by acting like it was a campaign rally. By tooting his own horn was the first thing that came out of his mouth. He proceeded to say that his government had done more in 2 years than any government in the US in history. The response was laughter. The world took Donald Trump's words and dismissed them as a joke. Think about how significant that is. In past decades, in past generations, when the US spoke, the world listened because they knew the giant was going to cause trouble. They knew that something serious was happening, that there was going to be a statement made that spoke to perhaps the future of US domestic and foreign policy, particularly foreign policy for the next few years. But on this occasion, when Donald Trump spoke, he was laughed at. He went on to talk about how America wanted peace. He went on to talk about how there had to be an improvement of relations, how the U.S. wanted there to be no war. They wanted there to be peace. But it was everybody else who wanted war. Specifically, he claimed that it was Iran that was seeking war with its neighbors, that Iran was seeking war with the U.S. This is complete and utter nonsense. It is Trump who withdrew from the peaceful agreement, the JC, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal, a deal which every side except the U.S. has certified that Iran was living up to. But it was the U.S. president who withdrew, sabotaged the entire agreement, and then demanded a return to the table. So while Iran was doing everything that they said they were going to do, everything that they were obligated by the agreement to do, it's the U.S. who dares stand there and give this whole lofty notion, this whole, utter, complete garbage about how it was Iran that was in violation, or that it was Iran that was doing wrongdoings. The JPCOA is a collection of countries that agreed to relieve certain sanctions on Iran if they complied with the agreement. There's about 6 countries involved in this. The United States unilaterally withdrew and sabotaged the entire agreement. Now they return to the table and want a bilateral talk. I think it's very clear what's going on. There was an agreement that involved other countries so that the U.S. didn't have complete hegemonic control over it. If the U.S. just decided they wanted to do some kind of economic damage to Iran, they would have to get it past the other members of the agreement. But that's not what they want. They want to be able to just do whatever it is that they want, cause the harm that they want, whatever complete phony pretext it is. So by getting rid of the agreement and trying to sign a bilateral one directly between the United States and Iran with no other parties involved, it gives the U.S. the freedom to act without conscience, which is basically how they have acted. There's no one to hold them accountable as there is now with the other signatories to the agreement to say, no, you are lying, Iran is in full compliance, and they are many of them are still trying to carry out this agreement to this day. On what moral high ground does the U.S. have that they can denounce the actions of others who are trying to defend themselves while the U.S. is drowning in a sea of its own hypocrisy? It's the U.S. that has pushed to the Syrian conflict. They have helped fuel the Saudi imperialist occupation war and, frankly, genocide against the Yemeni people. And they've remained basically silent on the crimes that have been committed by Saudi Arabia. They hardly mentioned the bus full of children that was deliberately struck by Saudi Arabia, killing, I believe it was 40 children, in an absolute disgrace of a movement, a moment. And all of this is being responded to by Trump being laughed at. The so-called leader of the free world is standing there before the world being laughed at. Why, I didn't expect that kind of response. Well, you should have. Because when you stand before the UN, when you stand before the international community, you're not surrounded by a bunch of pathetic yes men that are trying to kiss up to you. You're surrounded by people that you have murdered. People that you have bombed, people whose economies you've tried to destroy, people whose lives in countries you've tried to ruin. If not you, then your predecessors. And you dare wonder why you didn't receive a warm welcome by people that you have tortured, people you have destroyed, and instead are laughed at for a completely nonsense statement like claiming that your administration in the first 2 years has done more than any in U.S. history. That is absolute nonsense. You pale in comparison to what was done during the Great Depression. You pale in comparison to what was even done by Reagan. This is complete and absolute nonsense. Many of those who have had the feeling that America had some kind of moral right, some kind of divine right to leadership, the American exceptionalism, should have been woken up by what was heard today. They should have seen Trump as he was being laughed at. You could kind of see the anger in his face when everybody reacted to him like he was a joke. That this veneer of superiority that the U.S. has always walked around with, this kind of self-identified superiority, was torn away with that act. And I think this being laughed at by the UN is something that's going to be significant for Donald Trump. It may not seem like it right now, but I think he's definitely going to be angry about this. He's going to be angry about being laughed at. And when he returns to Washington and continues to write or have some kind of say, or however it is his administration allegedly works, in foreign affairs, I can almost guarantee you will become more aggressive. He will continue to push to an even greater degree this idea that somehow the United States is ripped off by the rest of the world. Well, it is that the U.S. plunders everyone else. He even went so far as to say that OPEC is ripping off the U.S., the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. The world's big oil producers are ripping off the U.S.? Exactly how is that? If we were going to approach this from an honest eye, OPEC is basically an oil cartel that fixes prices. And you have countries, very small members, that are trying to barely get by due to U.S. sanctions. But the U.S. president has the audacity to stand before the world and say that everybody else is taking advantage of the U.S. The U.S. is the richest country in the world, with the greatest military power, that exploits everybody else, that robs the world of its resources, that invades it, murders it, without any kind of humanity whatsoever. And they dare see themselves as the victims. On what basis can Trump ever make this claim? It speaks to possibly the insanity of the U.S. And I don't mean Trump personally. I mean the general American population tends to feel this way. That somehow the rest of the world has treated the U.S. unfairly. Or that somehow the world is taking advantage of the American people. Such is complete, utter nonsense. You get this idea that when people immigrate or come as refugees to the U.S., they're stealing what the Americans have worked so hard to have, while completely ignoring that it has been their actions, their plundering, their looting of the world through violence that has caused people to become the migrants, to become the refugees that are trying to come into the country. They did it. At what point can you see yourself as the victim for having destroyed and bombed and murdered others? Now, I think this speech by Donald Trump, that this is a significant moment where a world leader was laughed at. Someone who a country that sees themselves as the divine essence of the world, the moral leaders of the world, was laughed off of the stage like the ridiculous notion that it stands for. And President Trump deserves no better. At no point should any more respect be shown for Donald Trump or the U.S. empire. In fact, it deserves much worse. One of those being dragged by the hair to the International Criminal Court and finally be put on trial for the crimes that it has committed against humanity, against the entire world.
Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.